Shortly after protests seeking justice for George Floyd, an African American who was killed during a police arrest, began in the United States, people in Australia protested to show solidarity with Americans in the Black Lives Matter movement, and to demonstrate against issues with police brutality and institutional racism. Racism in Australia, and Aboriginal deaths in custody. Vigils and protests of thousands of participants have taken part nationwide. The COVID-19 pandemic made its way to Australia, with the first recorded case in January. By March, social distancing rules were implemented and international borders closed to non-residents. March also saw lockdown, with services deemed non-essential by governments forced to close. In May, whilst Australia had flattened its curve, states still had various restriction and social distancing measures, which included limits on gatherings. On May 25, U.S. police responded to a call-out. As a result, a black man, George Floyd, was arrested for allegedly using counterfeit money. Once restrained, George Floyd repeatedly stated, "I can't breathe," whilst a white officer knelt on his back until he died. When footage of the arrest and death was released, all officers affiliated with the arrest were fired. George Floyd's death was ruled a homicide by the coroner, with charges being laid against the officers. The death of George Floyd led to widespread protests in the U.S. as his death became a focal point for race relations, institutionalized racism and police brutality. Police brutality in the United States was a long-standing social issue, with activists often protesting against excessive force and high incarceration rates of African Americans. Aside from solidarity with U.S. protesters, these themes also resonated in Australia, where the media, considering similarities with Aboriginal deaths in custody and wider social issues faced by Indigenous Australians. Oppression of Indigenous Australians is a prominent theme in modern Australian history. Despite encountering Indigenous Australians upon arrival, British forces invoked the principle of terra nullius to claim the continent. This was followed by a long period of recurrent massacres and violent conflicts. By the 20th century, the Australian government adopted a policy of forcibly separating mixed-race Indigenous children from their families, which remained in place until the 1970s. In 1987, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody was appointed to investigate 99 cases of Aboriginal deaths in custody during the 1980s. As of 5 June 2020, an additional 434 Aboriginal Australians had died in custody since the Commission's findings were handed down in 1991. As of 2016, while Indigenous Australians accounted for roughly 2% of Australia's total population, they made up 27% of the national prison population, with incarceration rates rising markedly in the preceding decade. The George Floyd protests in Australia often referenced recent instances of Aboriginal deaths in custody. These include the 2014 death of Ems Dhu in police custody, the 2015 death of David Dingyi in a prison hospital, the 2017 death of Tanya Day in a police cell, and the forceful arrest of an Aboriginal teenager on 1 June 2020. Many Indigenous people have been frustrated that it took the death of a black man in the US to bring the focus onto the injustices here in Australia. Prime Minister Scott Morrison stated his beliefs that violent protests would not create change. He warned against Australian demonstrations taking a similar course, as there's no need to import things happening in other countries. Following major Australia-wide protests on 6 June, Morrison called them completely unacceptable and demanded an end to further protests. In addition to concerns around COVID-19, he stated that some protests had been hijacked by left-wing movements, and called for demonstrators at future events to be charged. However, after being challenged on his assertion that there had not been slavery in Australia, Morrison acknowledged that all sorts of hideous practices had taken place in the past. The Labour Party did not directly criticize people protesting, but said that everyone should follow the authorities' health advice. Senior Indigenous MP Linda Burney said that it was important for the media to focus on the issues, not whether people protested or not. Protests have occurred across the state, Australia's largest, to show solidarity with American protesters and to highlight the high rate of death among incarcerated Indigenous Australians. The protests were preempted by an incident wherein a 16-year-old Indigenous boy was kicked and pinned to the ground by a New South Wales police force officer in Surrey Hills. Protests that have occurred in the state have done so in violation of the state's coronavirus public health order, which bans gatherings of more than 10 people outdoors for a common purpose without a reasonable excuse or exemption. 3 major